Hi, everyone. Welcome to Inside Israel. I'm Joel Chasnoff coming to you live from Ra'anana, right outside of Tel Aviv. It's March 16th, 2025, and today's episode is called How Much Happy is Too Much, related to celebrating Purim here in Israel. Before we begin, I want to just give you a little bit of front matter. First of all, this week's episode on Apple and Spotify is not going to be the one that you see right now. Often I'll record this live session on Sunday nights and then take the recording and drop it on Wednesdays on Apple and Spotify so people can listen to it on their podcast players, on their phones. That is not what is happening this week. This week, I have an interview that's going to drop on Wednesday. And this interview, it's a very cool one. It's with Dr. Asa Kasher. If you've heard of purity of arms is the Israeli army's code for ethics in battle. In Hebrew, it's called Tohar HaNeshek. In my opinion, and actually in many people's opinion, including military experts around the world, Israel's code of ethics is actually more stringent and more comprehensive than that of any other military. And this code of ethics, which we call purity of arms, Torah Neshek, the lead author on this document was Dr. Asa Kasher from Tel Aviv University. He's now quite older. He wrote this in the 90s, so we're talking about over 20, 30 years ago. But he's still very involved with the IDF, consults, speaks about the ethical dilemmas that IDF soldiers face in battle. And I sat down with him for a face to face interview recently about why he authored this document, why he felt it was necessary, how it's different from the code of ethics of other militaries around the world. We also talked a lot about Gaza and the dilemmas that soldiers have been facing in Gaza, where Hamas is using civilians as human shields. And we also talk about why the rest of the world just doesn't seem to get it. And to be clear, Dr. Kasher is not a rah-rah cheerleader for the IDF no matter what. He's very critical. And if anyone, he's watching with a more critical eye over the behavior of soldiers. But this is really a fascinating interview. If you've ever wondered about Israel's ethics in battle, their ethical code, how it came about, be sure to tune in on Wednesdays when the episode drops. And if you don't subscribe to the podcast already on Apple or on Spotify, just go ahead and do that on your podcast player. Put in Inside Israel with Joel Chasnoff. You can also go to joelchasnoff.com/podcast, and there's the buttons right there where you can link to it and download. You can also listen to the podcast on my website. So if you don't have a podcast player, just go to joelchasnoff.com/podcast, and the most recent episode will always be there in the audio. But the point is that this one that you're hearing right now is not the one that's going to drop on Wednesday. I really do encourage you to tune in for that talk with Dr. Asa Kasher. The second piece of front matter that I want to run by you is I need some feedback from you. I'm actually considering phasing out the live broadcasts, these ones that I do typically on Sunday nights, and instead having only the more traditional podcast drop on Wednesdays on Apple and Spotify. Um, so I'd like to hear from you what you think of that. It has to do with my tour schedule, with pursuing comedy here in Israel, and just the hours that make finding the time to do the live broadcast a little more challenging than it used to be. I also want to know if people are still getting getting something out of it. Right after October 7th is when I began these live broadcasts, and the purpose was really to give people an up close look at what life was like in Israel for those of us living here in the aftermath of October 7th. But that's, believe it or not, over a year and a half ago. And I've sometimes wondered if maybe the live broadcasts have fulfilled their purpose, but that their purpose is no longer necessary. And instead, it would just make it more streamlined for me and also for the listeners at home to have only one broadcast happening, which is the one that drops on Wednesday. So I would love to hear some feedback from you. Typically, I hear from people who are against new ideas, but if you are okay with this, I'd love to hear from you as well, just so I can get as large a sample size as possible. And the best place to do that is, again, through my website. Just contact me through email or through there's a query box at the bottom. But what do you think of this idea of maybe phasing out the live broadcasts and only having the traditional podcast, like most podcasts are, dropping, my case, on Wednesdays? Okay. So now let's get into tonight's episode. It's called How Much Happy is Allowed? And I chose this topic because I realized, or it occurred to me, that this year's Purim celebration here in Israel is a lot more joyful than last year's. Last year's was, the first Purim after October 7th. People were still in that state of shock. And so it really was a toned down Purim celebration. I'm seeing much more joy this year. And I don't know how to feel about that. I'm seeing parades. There was an adult party here in Ra'anana at the local gymnasium. And there's sort of a sports center with a pool and a tennis court, all the tennis courts in the gymnasium. There was an adult party. I mean, it reminded me of homecoming. I stopped by just to peek inside. I did not attend the party, but there were adults in costumes, uh, you know, Cinderellas and cowboys and ballerinas and but adults dancing to loud, pulsy fraternity music, and of course carnivals and all the usual stuff for kids. But on a much higher level than I saw last year. And I'm telling you, I really don't know how to feel about this. On the one hand, I feel that it's wrong. I did not attend this adult party. Dorit and I considered going, but we both kind of felt that as long as there are still hostages in Gaza, it's just, at minimum irresponsible, but more that sort of out of taste, tasteless, to disrespectful to attend a party while we still have fellow civilians who are chained in dungeons underneath Gaza, undergoing hell. So maybe, so that dilemma is eating at me. At the same time, what does that mean? That Israelis never celebrate anymore? That we're never joyful? That we never smile? Movie theaters are full. I went to a movie last night. Plays are still being put on at Habima Theater and the main theaters in Jerusalem and all over the country. Entertainment is happening. I've been pursuing stand up here, and part of what I've been doing is just going out to the clubs and watching comedians and learning about the scene. And let me tell you, people are attending stand up comedy shows. During the week, they're not always sold out, but on weekends, they typically are. People want humor, they want stand up. So I'm really torn here. I'm On the one hand, I feel like if anyone needs to smile and celebrate, it's Israelis because of all we're going through. And yet at the same time, something just makes me a little sick about it and uncomfortable, which is why I didn't attend that party the other night. Looping back to the stand up, I must say, I'm seeing a lot of comedy, not a lot, but a significant amount, a surprising amount of comedy about Gaza, about war, even in some tangential ways about hostages. It's never making fun of the hostages or making fun of injured or, God forbid, killed soldiers, but more making fun of the situation we're dealing with, the struggle we have, even daily, over how upset to get over the complications of daily life in Israel, when at the same time we know that our situation is infinitely better than those of the families who have hostages still in Gaza, and even more infinitely better, if that's possible, than those who are in Gaza themselves. So we're all struggling with this conflict of how happy can I be? How upset should I be when things don't go my way? Because relatively, our lives are sweet compared to so many other people in this country. And so that's the dilemma I wanted to put forward in today's episode and talk about a little bit. Another way to look at it is this: it's occurred to me that if anyone deserves to be happy, it's Israelis. And that if anyone should tone down their celebrations, it's Jews living in other places around the world. And I don't mean that as an insult to you guys watching right now, you personally, but it's sort of the idea that Israelis are bearing most of the burden, by far, most of the burden for what is happening in Israel right now. Now, it just occurs to me that I'm totally ignoring the waves of anti Semitism that you're experiencing in the US and Australia and England. And so you too deserve to have a joy and a break from all of the tragedy that we've been enduring together. But I saw an interesting story this week about a professor at Hebrew University. His name is Jonathan Dekel Chen. And if that name sounds familiar, it's because Jonathan Dekel Chen at Hebrew U is the father of Sagi Dekel Chen, who was a hostage in Gaza for, I believe, over 500 days, or certainly close to 500 days, and only recently was released. And in an interview this past week, Jonathan Dekel Chen, who not only is a professor, but he's a history professor, and so he really has that 30,000-foot view of history. He really called out the Jewish communities around the world for not doing enough to help free the hostages. And his accusations really were targeting not the everyday layperson, but the leaders of Jewish communities around the world, including rabbis and leaders of Jewish big nonprofit organizations. And he spoke about I'll quote him, he said, the inability, unwillingness, or the fear of Jewish leaders around the world to advocate on behalf of the hostages. And he gave a few reasons for this. He said that many Jewish leaders in other countries are simply afraid of crossing the Israeli government, meaning they're afraid of saying anything that would be in conflict with Netanyahu and his ruling coalition. Maybe just because they think it's not the right thing to do to argue with the leaders of the Jewish state or to take a position opposite theirs, but also because they could be afraid of repercussions, whether it's funding or partnerships or access to projects that they would be blackballed or just shut out because the government is angry at them. Another reason he gave was turf wars, that there's too much fighting in the US over who owns what position among Jewish organizations. And people are afraid of these organizations, these leaders are afraid of losing membership and ceding ground for what's their turf. And so that's another reason they don't come out in support of freeing the hostages. He mentioned the fear of anger within their own communities. And I really relate to this. I know I know many rabbis or maybe not many. There's a significant number of rabbis I've spoken to who are dealing with this dilemma that on the one hand, the rabbi might have a very strong opinion pro Israel, but they're concerned that some of their congregants are a little more, what do you want to call it, left or progressive or woke or whatever it is, and that they see the Palestinian side as well and are worried about casualties on the Palestinian side. And so it makes the rabbi uncomfortable to speak from the bima too forcefully about his or her own Israel related opinions. So there's that angst among the leadership maybe of how the Jew on the street actually feels about Israel versus Gaza. And then there's the fear of losing their leadership position. Professor Dekelchen mentioned that he thinks a lot of the leaders in the US simply are afraid that they'll be removed from their position, whether it's fired or their contracts not renewed, if they take too strong of a stance in favor of Israel. And you got to ask, what world are we living in where being pro Israel would actually cause you to lose your job in the Jewish world? But according to Professor Dekelchen, he thinks that this is a real factor. And He believes that the Jewish community around the world, these communities around the world, have not done enough, specifically these Jewish organizations. And he actually used the word an embarrassment. He says that the American Jewish response to the hostage situation is a quote, an embarrassment, and he calls out the leaders in particular. And I got to say, I've alluded to this idea before on this podcast that there's certainly room for debate, certainly the ethical debates that Israel faces when fighting a population like the Gazans in Gaza, where the Gazans are used as human shields. There are a lot of ethical dilemmas, and there's a lot of collateral damage, and this is disturbing. But I've always said that I feel this is something we need to discuss amongst ourselves within our own community and not air out our dirty laundry in public. And I've been really, really disturbed. The recent example that many of you might remember is all those rabbis who took out the full page ad in the New York Times, uh, against Israel and on behalf of the Palestinians. And I'm not saying that these problems don't exist, but I have not seen the blanket support of Israel that you would think that we would see in a time like this. Instead, I see a lot of angst and hand wringing among uh, among some Jewish organizations, definitely some congregations that I didn't expect to be there. And so when I saw that Professor Dekelchen, who again is a history professor, was mentioning this, I immediately related, and I knew I wanted to talk about it here because I do agree that it's both surprising and shocking, and it's also a problem. I do think when we look back on this 30 years from now, I do think we're going to judge Jewish communities around the world harshly. That for over 500 days there were Jews chained up in dungeons because they were Jewish, and there was only one march on Washington D.C. that entire time, and it happened what, a month or two after October 7th, and since then there hasn't really been anything on a mass level. It just seems like for many people the hostage situation is a shame and it's too bad it happened, but people aren't really taking action to do anything about it in Jewish communities outside of Israel. And Israelis are feeling the brunt of the burden. So I wanted to bring that up. And that also relates to that idea of how happy we Israelis are allowed to be on a holiday like this. Are we allowed to be joyful? Are Jews around the world allowed to be joyful? Are people allowed to go on with their lives? Even now, when you ask an Israeli how things are, what we'll say is beseder given the circumstances. It's always in our minds of what else is going on. No one is completely mushlam. No one is completely whole or at peace as long as there are hostages still in Gaza. Now, as for the news angle of this story, what's up with the ceasefire? What's up with hostage talks? I will tell you, I have no idea. And it's not just me. Most of us Israelis are thoroughly confused right now as to what is happening. We finished phase one of the hostage deal. We were supposed to immediately move into phase two. From what a lot of us are hearing, it's Israel who is stopping the progress into phase two. And many of us feel that it's Netanyahu who really wants to stop the progress of the negotiations because, as I've said before, once the hostages are all out, it's very likely that the government will crumble. And this isn't just me. We're well over 70% of Israelis right now who believe that Netanyahu needs to step down. That means resign now, and that new elections need to be held. And far more than 50% of the country believes that Netanyahu is negotiating, thinking of himself and his political ambitions first, and the hostages second, if even second. So we're really just, as far as a lot of us are concerned, we're at a loss. On the one hand, the talks are supposed to continue, but since they're not, basically what's happening is that Hamas now has a ceasefire without having to give up anything, because we're not really fighting Hamas in Gaza right now. We have troops there, but there's not a lot of combat happening. We're not taking action against Hamas. So Hamas is able to recruit new members and build up their supplies and not have to give up anything in return. So I wish I could look you square in the eye and tell you exactly what's happening here, but like so many Israelis, I am thoroughly confused and at a loss. We can't understand why we're granting Hamas this sort of timeout where they can build up their forces, and at the same time we're not forcing them to give up anything in return. And like I said, there are still 24 living hostages in Gaza, 22 of whom are Israeli, two of whom I believe are of a different nationality, perhaps Thai. There is this new proposal, the Witkoff proposal, I believe it's called, or maybe now it's called something else, in which Hamas would give up four hostages, four dead hostages, and then one living hostage, Idan Alexander, who has U.S. citizenship. But apparently, Israel is saying that this is not a genuine offer from Hamas, that there are other demands they're making that are not being public. We really don't know what to believe in. We're all very confused. So if you're not quite sure what's going on, don't worry. You're not alone. Neither do we. Couple of questions and comments I wanted to share with you. So this one is from Anita. Anita wrote in, Shalom, Joel. Have you seen No Other Land? Is it available in Israel? And your thoughts? So No Other Land is a documentary that won Best Picture at the Oscars. I have not seen it. I don't know that I'll plan to see it. I can say a lot of Israelis are extremely frustrated, depressed, fed up, anguished that a movie like this would win the Oscar. Uh, it just feeds into this bigger problem we see, was that there was a ceasefire on October 6th. On October 7th, terrorists and civilians from Gaza poured into Israel, murdered, raped, killed children in front of their parents, and parents in front of their children, kidnapped, and yet the world grants its highest cinematic prize to a movie about the people who committed these atrocities. Is it it just makes us once again feel that the world is completely upside down. Yes, I realize one of the producers is Israeli, but there's always going to be people like this who hop on the bandwagon and see an opportunity, and this was his. It's not an Israeli movie. I believe it's a Scandinavian movie. I think maybe Norway is the one who funded it. But no, I have not seen it. I don't know if it's available. So that's a great question. I need to look into. I just got this question today. I will look into that for next week, but I have not seen it yet. So Caroline asks, she says, Joel, I just saw your latest talk on the various failures of the IDF. What I don't get is this. Even if each bit of intelligence was not on its own seen as threatening enough to be taken seriously for one reason or another, surely all of them together should have raised alarm bells. What do you think happened? And you have a great point, Caroline, that any one of these things, for example, the activation of SIM cards the night between October 6th and 7th, all these Israeli SIM cards were activated in Gaza, which is sort of a clue that Hamas is now going to try to use these SIM cards in Israel. That on its own maybe didn't spark a response among the military. But that, in addition to all the accounts from the Tatzpitaniyot, the women watching the border, and the report called Jericho Walls that we intercepted by our intelligence team, and etc. Like, you would think all these together, yes, would lead to us realizing that an attack was imminent. But I think what you need to understand, Caroline, is the box that Israeli intelligence officials had put themselves in. They were so closed-minded and so unable to see past the walls that they had constructed around themselves. They had a paradigm of who Hamas was and what Hamas wanted. And there was nothing in the world that could shake them from that paradigm. In fact, I would argue that the clues we had leading up to October 7th were as strong as you possibly could have asked for. There is nothing stronger than what we saw. The rehearsals. They had rehearsals in Gaza of taking over mock Israeli villages, including, I believe, a mock Israeli tank. The SIM cards, the approaching the border several times before October 7th. They approached the border. It's not like we should have had stronger clues or better intel. That's what's so maddening here. But the ribua, I mean, that's what we say in Hebrew. Ribua means square. And they were so merubaim, which is an adjective, which means squared in. That's how we feel here in Israel, that the intelligence community was just so boxed in by their own paradigm of who Hamas was that they were literally incapable of reading the intelligence differently. So even if we had double the intelligence that we had leading up to October 7th, I highly doubt that action would have been taken. It was simply unfathomable. It wasn't even on the table as an option. Ravitala wrote, Joel, I'm an Israeli who listens to your podcast, enjoying your podcast for a while after you were introduced by someone else to me. I have no American inclination. I started to look for content that tells me something about how our brothers and sisters at the around the world and diaspora feel since the terrible 7th of October. And she writes as an Israeli, today I received the recent broadcast and wanted to tell you, kol hakavod, that you had the courage stating your thoughts about the problematic prime minister of ours. I appreciate it. And I'm reading this not to toot my own horn. I'm reading this because I want to reinforce to a lot of you at home just how many Israelis agree with me that Bibi has got to go and that Bibi is taking this country down the wrong path. I mean, when I tell you that well over 70% of Israelis think that Netanyahu needs to resign, who does that leave? That leaves about 28% of the country that doesn't. And that 28% of the country that doesn't think he should resign, some of those are the ones who answered, I'm not sure. So you really only have about 20% who believes that Bibi should not resign. And that's always going to be there. We know enough about extreme politicians at this point to know that no matter what happens, there's still going to be that core 20 to 25% who sticks by the leader no matter what. I mean, talk about being boxed in. Here's another example of people can simply make themselves prisoners of their own paradigm. But it's really important for me, as someone who's trying to show you where Israelis are at and what Israelis are thinking, I want you to know how frustrated Israelis are with this government. We feel like we, the citizens, our hands are tied. We're running out of soldiers right now in Gaza and Lebanon. We don't have enough soldiers to continue to fight on these fronts. They're extending the service of soldiers who are in the army now, raising the age of the reserve duty for men and women in certain roles. And yet at the same time, they're considering giving millions, if not billions, of shekels to the Haredim, the ultra Orthodox, who continue to not serve. You know, a report just came out last week. I might have mentioned this in the last broadcast that there were 10,000 draft notices sent out to the ultra Orthodox community over the past few months, and only 177 showed up for their draft. That means 9,800 plus were simply ignored, and no action is being taken against them. Meanwhile, we've had over 500 soldiers die in Gaza since the start of the war, and that doesn't include what happened on October 7th. So if you want to understand Israelis and where they're at right now, you need to understand. I'm not speaking to you as an American who lives here and knows both sides of the pond. I'm speaking to you as someone who is rooted here and who knows what Israelis are talking about. We are extremely frustrated with the government, with Netanyahu, the more we learn about his and his family's antics and what they've been up to since October 7th and before. And that is where the Israeli mentality is. And yet we feel stuck. What more can we do? How many more times do we have to protest? We simply don't believe anymore that the government will take notice or will take any action based on what the citizens want. They are only out for themselves. So you need to understand that frustration as well. I'm going to close this broadcast by reminding you that I do want to hear from you about the possibility of phasing out the live broadcasts, moving down the road, perhaps after Passover. I really do want to hear your honest opinion on that. Again, this week's episode on Apple and Spotify is going to be my interview with Asa Kasher, who helped author Purity of Arms, the Code of Ethics of the IDF for moral behavior in battle. Next week's live broadcast, it is still here for the time being, is going to be March 23rd, Sunday, once again at 1 p.m. Eastern Time. I always enjoy hearing your questions and hearing from you. You can write to me through joelchasnoff.com. Thank you so much for showing up, everyone, and I look forward to seeing you next week. Be sure to tune in this Wednesday to the interview as well. Yom Tov.